1:30 tour, all aboard. Hi.
Hello.
You all waiting for the tour? Come on in, have a seat.
Okay.
Grab a tie, watch for splinters. So, my name is Dick. I've been a docent here at the museum for a few years. And among other things, I give an occasional tour. So, the tour will take probably a little over half an hour, give or take a bit. And we'll real briefly run through some history. Start on a tour through the museum, hitting a few of the highlights and talking about building the Transcontinental Railroad. And at the end of the tour, I'll give you opportunity for questions and hopeful answers, and tell you about a few other things in the museum that the tour doesn't have time to cover, and turn you loose. At that point, you can either come back and look at things in more detail or go on off on your own, whichever you like. So, basically, early experiments in what became railroads, probably dated even into the 1700s. There was an early experimental locomotive in 1804, but the first railroads as such, recognized as such, were England in the 1820s. Hi, coming for the tour? Good, you're just in time. Looks like we have a few more. Hold on a minute. So, hi folks, welcome. Pull up a tie, watch for splinters. As I was explaining, the first railroads recognized as such were in England in the 1820s. And pretty soon, things and people were moving at previously unimagined, and some people even thought ungodly, speeds of 15, 20, even 30 miles an hour or more. Imagine that. Before railroads, life on land basically moved at the speed of a walk. Then, railroads turned out to be such a good idea that they rapidly spread throughout the world, especially Europe and especially America. Back in the 1830s, America was mainly concentrated along the eastern seaboard and maybe a little bit inland. So, right from the beginning, though, a few wild, crazy-eyed dreamers, more or less, had this crazy idea. Why don't we build a railroad all the way across North America? Tap into the clipper ship trade to China and Japan. Yeah. Anyway, 1840s saw a number of developments. America started having the beginnings of a well-developed rail system. The telegraph was invented. Now, you can think of the telegraph as the first, earliest form of today's internet. For the first time, information could be sent at the speed of light. Baud rate's a little different, though. A good telegrapher can transmit at 20 words a minute. Now, also, people in the East started hearing about these wild, far-off, exotic places and began migrating by wagon train to what we now know of, well, and even then was known of as California and Oregon. And then in 1848, descended about 40 miles east of where we are here, something happened that really changed things in a big hurry for California. Anybody know what I'm thinking of? Gold. Oh, wow, you're all up on it. You're right, gold and then our hills. Well, And that set off the Great Gold Rush of 1849, where hundreds of thousands of people from all over California moved here hoping to get rich quick. Turned out most of the ones that got rich were not the miners. They were the merchants selling stuff to the miners. By the 1850s, enough business had grown up in the area that local businessmen formed the first railroad in California. No, it was not the Central Pacific. It was the Sacramento Valley Railroad. Started at the Sacramento River docks right outside the museum doors over here. Long distance, went all the way to the next city to the east, Folsom, 22 miles. Now, I mentioned how fast things could go. A wagon load of freight from the river docks to Folsom took 2 days, typically. The Sacramento Valley Railroad opened for business, and the same wagon load of freight could now be loaded on a rail car and arrive in Folsom in 2 hours. That's just one example. Chief engineer on that railroad was a man named Theodore Judah. He was one of these dreamers about a transcontinental railroad. On his own time, he made 22 survey trips up into the Sierra Mountains, found a practical route, and started trying to talk people into backing his idea. Theodore, you're crazy. Build a railroad across 1,800 miles of nothing. There's not enough business along the way to support it. Well, he persisted, and right here in Sacramento, he found a group of backers. 4 of them went on to become known as the Big Four. And they became kind of like the Warren Buffetts and Bill Gateses and Mark Zuckerbergs of today. They raked in a little bit of money. Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins were known as the Big Four. There were others, but they were the Big Four. So, trouble's getting the idea of a railroad across. Now that they got the idea, finding the funding. They talked Congress into passing the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. That act gave the Central Pacific, going to build east, and a new one called the Union Pacific, going to build west, starting in Omaha. Each railroad was going to get government bonds for completed miles of track across, and mineral rights and timber rights and a few other perks, including land grants. Now you notice the funding was bonds, not stimulus cash. Those bonds were hard to sell. Something else was going on at that time. The Civil War. The country was at war with itself. What? You want me to buy a bond to build a railroad across 1,800 miles of nothing, backed by a government at war with itself? Might not be around in a few years to redeem the bond. Go away. Each railroad resorted to what I like to think of in today's terms of creative financing. There were huge financial scandals afterward, but the important thing is each railroad managed to keep enough money coming in to keep the supplies flowing in and keep building, hire enough people, that kind of thing. Which brings up another problem, especially for the Central Pacific. Supply line. Union Pacific at least had railroads in existence coming to Omaha to bring them stuff. Central Pacific did not. There were no railroads. They were building the first one. In those days, the two main ways between East and California and Oregon, wagon train, already mentioned. The other was clipper ship all the way around the tip of South America and back. Either option, you're looking at 4 to 7 months of a very dangerous journey. Something like 1 in 5 ships never made it. Something like 1 in 10 people traveling by wagon train never made it. Kind of hazardous. Yeah. Okay. Problems getting the idea across, getting the funding, long supply line. Let's go find out about a couple more problems they have. By the way, the Governor Stanford locomotive here is a prime example of the supply line. It is the first locomotive to arrive in Sacramento and get put to work on the Central Pacific. By the way, you notice it's labeled Governor Stanford. Leland Stanford was president of the board of directors of the railroad. So how come Governor Stanford? Leland had a sideline. He dabbled in politics. At the same time as that he was starting the railroad, the governor of California, pushing pro-railroad legislation through the legislature, was Leland Stanford. I think that's what we now call a conflict of interest. Thank you. Come on. Some slope roads. You can scoot over here if you want. Okay, one problem they had was, hey, Theodore, Judah, it snows in those mountains. And Theodore says, yeah, I know. I've been up there in the winter and it snows, but not all that much. We shouldn't have any trouble building the railroad and keeping it open year-round. Turned out Judah had been up there on his survey trips in years of light snowfall. And for those of you not familiar with California Sierra snow, a light year might be 10 feet for the season. Not too bad. Well, a few years later, the construction crews got up there, and as California weather is prone to do, the cycle flipped, and they hit heavy snow years, and a heavy snow year can run around the order of 60 feet for the season. So they tried armies of snow shovelers. They couldn't keep up. They tried early primitive snow plows pushed by locomotives. They weren't able to keep up. Boy, what are we going to do now? Aha! Snow galleries! Basically build this wood structure over the track to keep the snow off. And most of the time it works. In a 90-mile stretch of track going up the mountains, they ended up building 37 miles of snow gallery, plus a dozen tunnels. For some reason, this got nicknamed railroading inside the world's longest barn. Which created another problem in that the Governor Stanford and all its 250-some brothers and sisters that followed it burned wood. Here you are, inside the world's longest barn, in a locomotive throwing out sparks and embers. Yeah, not good. Fires were a constant problem as long as there were wood, snow sheds, and snow galleries up there. More important problem, though, was workers, laborers. Hey, we want a couple thousand men. Come help us build a railroad. At times, they were lucky to get a few hundred. Early years, a lot of the able-bodied men went off to fight the Civil War, and of the rest, most of them would rather go to the gold fields and the new silver fields in Nevada. Hey, we're going to pay good money, $40 a month. In those days, that was good, on average. And we'll provide food and shelter. Like I say, sometimes only a few hundred takers. Let's go find out what they did about that problem.
on the train from Provo.
Yeah.
So were we on that line?
Yes.
I'll be darned.
This lady has brought up a good point. The line that Theodore Judah laid out is still in use today. Approximately 90 to 95% of the route he surveyed is still in use today. He did a good job. Partly that and partly, well, there's only so many routes you can take through there. Anyway, story has it that somebody says, hey, we've got these people here in California since the gold rush. They're hardworking, they're industrious, and instead of $40 a month, they're willing to accept an average of $35 a month. And they'll provide their own food. Why don't we give them a try? Well, the reference was to the Chinese. At that time, the most heavily discriminated against group of people in California. The Chinese, those guys, they're so little and puny. How can they handle the heavy work? Look at the timbers they have to deal with and drilling tunnels through hard Sierra granite. Story goes on to say the counter response to that was, who built the Great Wall of China? They tried 50 of them or thereabouts. Worked out so well, they soaked up every available Chinese worker in California, wanted still more, and literally resorted to importing them by the boatload direct from China. We don't know exactly how many Chinese were put to work on the railroad, but estimates range all the way from 6 to 12,000. The railroad would not have been built without them, and we owe them a lot. Now, how do you drill tunnels through hard rock in the days before modern power tools? The steam drill of John Henry fame had not yet been invented. Modern high explosive had not yet been invented. Nitroglycerin had just come on the market. Dynamite was still in the future. Nitroglycerin was so touchy that after experimenting with it, they went back to the high explosive of the day, gunpowder, black powder. Oh, by the way, who invented black powder or gunpowder?
Chinese.
The Chinese, yeah. So, what you do is you take a workforce, divide it into two-person teams. One person picks up that long iron bar. Imagine holding that against the rock 10 to 12 hours a day, dawn to dusk. The other partner picks up that 12 to 16 pound sledgehammer, steps behind the first guy, lines up and takes a mighty swing. I hope he aims well. After pounding away on the drill into the rock away for several hours, you've got a hole. Like the gentleman up there is doing, you pack the hole full of gunpowder, stick in a fuse, take fuses from all the holes, braid them together, and everybody moves back except one guy. And I've never made up my mind whether he was brave or foolish. He got to light the match.
Drew the last straw. He drew the last straw.
Yeah, maybe. He got the short end of the stick. After the charges go off, the broken rock is picked up and loaded into the pickup truck of its day and hauled away and disposed of, or reused like in a retaining wall. The longest tunnel of 12 that the Chinese built, or that was built by the Central Pacific, was the Summit Tunnel, the highest one up, a bit over 1,600 feet long. The original estimates were 4 years. They did it in 2. Started a crew in at each end, sank a shaft in the middle, and put a crew out from there, going in each direction. Cut the time about in half. Now, if you take 1,600 feet, and, divide out by 4 teams, 2 years, you can see that drilling Sierra tunnels was not measured in feet per day, but inches, like 6 to 8 inches a day on average. So, they started building in 1863. Each railroad was given 10 years to finish their part of the project. Shall we go and find out how long it took?
A stretch of highway for them to pave it takes about 2 years also.
Yeah. Donner Pass was home to Indian trails, the Emigrant Wagon Trail, the Trans-Pacific or Transcontinental Railroad, the Lincoln Highway, the first national highway, US 40, and now is home to Interstate 80, and the railroad, of course, still goes through there. Along the way, the Central Pacific set a record. That record still stands for miles of hand-laid track, just over 10 miles in one day. It was part of a bet between the two railroads. A little background information. As I mentioned, each railroad was given 10 years to finish their part of the project. Also, each railroad was chartered to build a telegraph line beside it. And that telegraph line was useful for not only getting progress news out to the rest of the world, but for ordering in supplies, coordinating train movements back and forth. Very handy. Little more background information. Congress, in their infinite wisdom, and several revisions of the Pacific Railroad Act, said basically, the Union Pacific you build west, Central Pacific you build east. They neglected to mention anything about a final, definite meeting time or place. That put each railroad in a race against the other. They were getting paid by the miles of completed track. So, in order to try to establish priority, each railroad surveyors had passed each other by a couple of hundred miles. The roadbed crews getting ready to lay the track had passed each other by 100 miles or so. Finally, people said, hey, wait a minute. This is getting ridiculous. So they sat down and they hammered out an agreement for May 8, 1869 at Promontory, Utah. Promontory, Utah then and still today is not any form of city, town, village, or anything else other than an arbitrary dot on a map. The only thing there today is a National Park Service site where they use replica locomotives to reenact the famous Gold Spike ceremony. It's right on that spot, and right next to it you can see where the two railroads graded separate lines past each other for a number of miles. You can drive along part of the original track alignment if you wish, if you ever go there. Very interesting. Well, there were delays. The actual ceremony took place on May 10th, 1869. The word went out by telegraph, resulting in the country's first simulcast. Every telegraph station in the country shut down, waiting for that final word. Dot, 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 done. And I've read accounts where some of the parties in some of the big cities with speechifying and fireworks and other celebrating lasted 3 days. Why such a big deal? Well, the country was still recovering from the Civil War, which had ended just a few years earlier, It was in the middle of a recession, kind of like what we've been going through lately now. More importantly, though, what had been an arduous 4 to 7 month trek now could be done in as little as 1 week. Became a very, very big deal. Not only quicker, but cheaper. You didn't have to buy your own team of animals, your own wagon, stock it full of 6-month food supply and all that. Now you just went down to the station, put some money down, bought a ticket, and a week later, maybe, you were in California. Yeah, I can see why. Okay, so we're in 1869. It took a little over 6 years to finish building the railroad. That's gone up into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s.
Like she said, she was somehow included in some of the stuff we did with her.
The 1870s, 80s, and 90s coincided with the Victorian era, which in turn was well known for its high level of elaborate decor. Passenger coaches had fancy striping and lettering and interior decor. Even that humble freight locomotive behind you. Two-tone paint job, really fancy lettering, nickel and brass trim, white sidewall tires. However, it was not all rosy with the railroads in those days, especially for road crews. These were the days before modern automatic couplers and modern air brakes. To stop a train, the engineer would blow a special whistle signal. 2 men called brakemen would start at each end of the train. The brakeman would go to the end of the car he was on that had a brake wheel on it, crank that wheel on by hand, and that put the brakes on that one car. Then he'd jump the gap to the next car and do it all over again until hopefully they met in the middle and the train stopped more or less where intended. Even worse was, brakemen. Passenger cars have a center aisle, not too bad, but on freight cars like box cars, there is no center aisle. So the brake is up on the roof. So to apply the brakes and stop a train, the brakeman climbed up, walked along the top of the car on a couple of boards, no handrail, day, night, rain, snow, ice, mountain curves, whatever. A little hazardous. Worse yet was coupling and uncoupling the cars, making up and breaking up trains, hooking cars to other cars, that kind of thing. Okay, come on back. And now he gets to lose communication. And look how much room he has to work in, because his job is to take this link. And as that car comes toward him and crashes into this one, or makes contact, guide that link into the pocket of the oncoming car and drop a pin in to hold them in place. In those days, brakemen carried their resumes with them automatically. Rookie! Oh, you've been at it a while. If he hadn't lost hand, arm, leg, or life in the meantime. In those days, thousands of workers were killed on the railroads every year, and it was business as usual. Can't help it, he slipped. Can't help it, he fell asleep on the job. Yeah, whatever. Now we're going to step into the 1930s and give you a little more background. You might remember that the Union Pacific and Central Pacific were given land grants along the way. The government passed on title to various parcels of land along their right-of-way, and the railroads could do anything they wanted with that land. What they did fairly often is every time they needed some kind of railroad facility, be it a water tank in a town or all the way up to major rebuilding shops, they'd settle down, lay out where they were going to put their facility, take some of that other land grant land, draw out parcels, lots, auction them off, and lo and behold, overnight you had a new town. And of course, every town needs its own passenger station or freight station. And hundreds, thousands of communities throughout the West ended up getting train stations. So many that the major railroads had sets of standard plans. I need a trestle of this size, here's a plan for it. I need a station of this size, here's a plan for it. They'd maybe flip it like a house in a subdivision, maybe stretch it or shrink it a little bit, change the gingerbread outside, make it kind of unique. This is number 22 station built by the Southern Pacific, hundreds of copies made throughout the Southwest. In this particular case, family lived upstairs and the agent worked downstairs. Talk about multitasking. Yeah. Handle all kinds of inquiries from passengers, sell tickets to anywhere in North America, handle incoming and outgoing freight and baggage, and above all, take all kinds and originate all kinds of messages, not only railroad related, but for the local community. Your own janitorial duties, and of course that famous catchphrase, and other duties as required. Oh, by the way, you'll notice, yes, the agent is a lady. A lot of people don't realize back in the old days, even though it was a male-dominated industry, women have always had an important part in railroad. And they were especially valued as station agents and as telegraphers. They were kind of recognized as, yeah, a lot of times they're better than these guys. So, in this particular case, the agent is modeled after the mother of one of our volunteers, and the telegraph key in there is the one she used on the job. Now, talking about people working for the railroads went on to become the first big business as we know them. They needed thousands of employees, both in building and even afterward. So this area kind of gives you an idea of the many different kinds of employees that railroads did and to this day still use. Some were even big enough they had their own private police departments. And another important thing about railroads, back in the old days, they needed so many workers that they tended, depending on the area of the country, to take on minority groups. Out west, that tended to be Indians and Mexican Americans, and of course, out in the east and southeast, it tended to be African Americans. Those people working for the railroad capably and patiently laid the roots and groundwork for what later became civil rights and women's lib. especially during World War I and World War II, the men went off to fight the war and the women capably stepped in behind them. Even in shop forces and all that other supposed macho type stuff. Now, another thing of big business, for the first time, well, railroads enabled other big businesses to arise. Example, now you could go down to the station and wire to an Eastern manufacturer or distributor, I want a new sewing machine, or I need 1,000 tons of bridge steel. And now, in a matter of a few weeks to a few months, depending, and rather than months to years, what you ordered showed up on the railroad. That in turn gave rise to other big business. Anybody has a trivial example here of Montgomery Ward's or Sears Roebuck?
Sears houses.
Sears houses. Matter of fact, Sears was a railroad employee when he got started. Eastern manufacturer sent in a shipment of watches that never got picked up. Sears says, "What do you want me to do with these?" And, well, it costs too much to ship them back. You can have them. Okay, well, they look like pretty good watches, so he started selling them in the local community and to other railroad workers that needed accurate watches. So he got enough business going that he took on a watchmaker partner, a man named Roebuck.
Interesting.
So, we're almost done. Hang in there. Some railroads were so big they even had their own early HMOs. The Southern Pacific, for example, had so many employees over such a wide territory that they set up their own system of Southern Pacific hospitals. Local doctor couldn't handle the problem, the employee was entitled to go to the nearest SP hospital for treatment. In the early days, various railroad workers, be it clerks, locomotive engineers, boilermakers in the shops, you name it, formed together into brotherhoods patterned after the fraternal lodges. They provided social outlets, mutual training so a man could upgrade his skills and make more money. Over time, these brotherhoods evolved into today's labor unions. Little side note, see the Gold Coast car here? That is the equivalent of today's private executive jet aircraft. Back then and even still today, if you have enough money, you can buy your own private rail car, outfit the interior any way you like, and pay the railroad to take you anywhere it goes. This car was owned by two men who traveled all over the U.S. They primarily wrote and illustrated with photography railroad-themed books. There's a walkway around on the back side of the car. You're welcome to go up and take a look in. It's real interesting comparing the quarters and work area for the two-person crew with the owner's quarters. If you do go up there, look for the two things, the fireplace, and the tie-in with then Governor, later President Ronald Reagan. There's a tie-in. So, at our last stop, among other things, we're going to talk about and see the most important exhibit in the whole museum. Oh, by the way, the last spike that we mentioned back there. Turns out the jeweler made two of them. The second one was a virtual duplicate of the first one. It's still on its original casting screw, has a slightly better engraving job on it, including the correct date. Anyway, it was lost to history. And a few years back it surfaced. The museum acquired the lost spike, and I'll tell you where it is. This little exhibit shows the railroad facilities at a town called Allensworth, down in the Central Valley in California, kind of between Bakersfield and Fresno. Have you heard of Allensworth?
No.
It's noted for being the only California town established by, run by, administered by, and so on, by the black community. A man named Colonel Allensworth established it, was the primary driving force, and it is a state historic park now. It never really made a go of it as a farming community as intended because of inadequate water supplies. But if you ever get a chance, it's an interesting place to visit. Okay, here you can see modern knuckle couplers and the connections, the air hoses connecting modern air brakes. Now instead of cranking on brakes on each individual car, the engineer just moves a little lever up in the control cab, and within a few seconds the brakes can be applied at the far end of a mile-long freight train. Coupling is done automatically. The inventor got the idea from two clasping hands, and the knuckles push each other closed. The pin drops down automatically, and to uncouple, now you just lift the lever at the corner of the car, outside the car, a little safer. And as the cars pull apart, the knuckles pull each other open again, and now they're cocked, ready to couple onto another car later. The most important exhibit in the whole museum, at least economically, this is it. Okay, I think some of you might be a little confused. Hey, that thing's only a humble little freight car. What's the big deal?
Refrigerator.
This is a refrigerator car, as the gentleman says. Early version, non-mechanical. This one was cooled by 300-pound blocks of ice, chopped up and dropped into bunkers at the end. Why is it so important? Well, the development of this car enabled California agriculture to become what it is today. Numbers I've heard, as of a few years ago, all the gold dug up since the gold rush, about $33 billion in what, 160 years, something like that. We still have active gold mines in California. That same year, that number came out, agricultural produce in 1 year leaving California, not counting what we as 1/10 of the population eat ourselves, but leaving California, 30 billion. All of it shipped in the height in refrigerator cars like this. There were tens of thousands of these crisscrossing the country. And now I think you get an idea of why that one's economically the most, and that's only one kind of commodity. Don't forget all the California oil, and all the cars, and all the other products, and all the shipments in from overseas, all transported by rail through California. Okay. You see that little tea kettle of a locomotive over that way? to that big picture window. That's the smallest steam locomotive to ever operate on the Southern Pacific Railroad. Started out life as Central Pacific number 3. A few years later, the Big Four set up the Southern Pacific. That locomotive transferred over and became SP number 1. 40,000 pounds. By contrast, turn this way a little bit, you can see the front end of 4294. That one was built in 1944. Shows the difference in development in just like 82 years. That one's 125 feet long and weighs in over 1 million pounds. You can go up in the control tab and find out why it's unusual, not only because of size, but the cab's in the front. All other steam locomotives, the control cab's behind the boiler. And also, the docent on duty up there will be happy to show you the air brakes. In the far corner of that side of the roundhouse is a railway post office car. Imagine a crew of a dozen or more post office clerks sorting mail while traveling up to 70 miles an hour. Over this way, you see the stainless steel car. That is the dining car for a train called the Super Chief. It traveled between Chicago and Los Angeles as part of the elite passenger train of its day. Just beyond it, there's a average run-of-the-mill sleeping car, so you can get a taste of not both parts of passenger travel and both ends of the spectrum. You'll start going through the sleeping car, which is also our special effects car. Imagine traveling at 50 miles an hour on a nice foggy night. There's another big picture window over there. Just outside it is the main line that comes through Sacramento to and from the Bay Area and part along the coast north and south. That is the I Street Bridge that it crosses the river on. 2 train tracks on the bottom, a 2-lane city street above. The bridge is 100 years old this year, and it still opens up in the middle, pivots around, and lets boat traffic up and down the river. So, overhead we have a narrow gauge freight train right over here, right above us. Over on that part of the second floor gallery is a marvelous toy train gallery, including an operating 4-track toy train layout. And the children of all ages won't want to miss it. Right outside the glass doors that way is our turntable. You put a locomotive or car on it, you can turn it around and line it up onto a different track, and that's how you can move things around from one to the other. That turntable is about 100 years old and we still use it all the time. Probably once a week, at least on average, we rearrange the furniture.
Oh my goodness, that'd be fun to see.
Yep. We'll move in one car, locomotive or another. Sometimes both of those go out for the evening. They have a special reception of some sort in this area. So,
And those trains still fire up?
some of them do. Some of them are,
Probably not so much as steam.
some of them are very, very close to operating, but they're at a point in their lives where to operate them, they're going to need a extensive federal safety examination. Expensive to run, so they're almost there. Could be if needed, but as long as they're not quite there, I know, political games, but with the economy what it is, and the state budget what it is, and especially state parks budget what it is. For those of you out of state, the California State Parks has about 300 units in it, and 70 of them are slated for closure for the first time ever. And in all but a handful of cases, local community groups and jurisdictions have stepped in to provide enough funding to help them keep them open, luckily. So, anyway, I've been beating my gums long enough.
Spike.
Thank you, the lost strike. Go past 4294, the cab forward locomotive, turn left, it's down at 125 feet away at the other end.
Okay. It was
Okay.
great. Thank you.
Thank you.
How long, how much fuel would that provide on the old locomotives?
The cab forward, yeah,
I
well,
mean, you have all that wood there. How much would that, how many days would that last in the locomotive for how many hours?
several hours.
Several hours? And then
They'd have to stop and re-water and re-wood several times a day, average working day. The cab forward burns fuel oil.
Okay.
The tender holds 7,000 or 8,000 gallons of fuel oil. That would be good for a day's run. And it also holds about 20,000 gallons of water. Typically they'd stop for a water stop twice a day, maybe 3. So yeah, very fuel and water hungry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was
Oh,
most
no.
interesting.
Tell you what, you stop at the front counter and donate it to the museum, please.
All right. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
You're quite welcome.